My name is Salma Hayek. I've been married to Ethan for over 8 years. We met at a professional conference in San Francisco. I was presenting on nonprofit leadership, and he was attending a panel about educational equity. We bumped into each other in line at a taco truck. It was drizzling, I was cold, he offered to share his umbrella, and somehow we ended up talking for 2 hours straight about travel, family, faith, and what it meant to truly show up for someone. Ethan was everything I never knew I needed. He listened with his full body. He remembered details. He was gentle without being passive and confident without being controlling. I fell for him fast. Our relationship was steady from the start. No mind games, no mixed signals. He proposed a year later under the old willow tree in Golden Gate Park. We got married the following spring in a small garden ceremony with wildflowers and homemade vows. People always told me, "You're so lucky, Salma. Ethan's a keeper." And for the most part, I believed them. But what I didn't realize was that Ethan came with strings. And those strings were tightly knotted around 2 women who knew exactly how to pull them: his mother, Linda, and his younger sister, Megan. At first, I thought their closeness was sweet. The inside jokes, the Sunday dinners, the way they texted in group chats about everything from grocery lists to movie nights. But over time, I started noticing things, like how Ethan would flinch a little when I suggested we travel somewhere for the holidays instead of going to his mom's house, or how his phone would light up at 11 p.m. with messages from Megan, always labeled urgent, always ending with, "Please don't tell Salma." I tried not to be paranoid. Families have their own rhythms, I told myself. Besides, they weren't cruel to me. Linda was polite, in that distant, tight-smiled kind of way. Megan was bubbly, even funny at times, but I always felt like I was stepping into a conversation I wasn't invited to. Still, I let it go. We had a good life, steady jobs, a cozy townhouse, our dog Jasper, and a future that felt full of promise. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just wrapped up a donor meeting when Ethan called me in a hushed voice. "Salma, I need to tell you something," he said. My heart skipped. "What's wrong?" "It's Megan. It's Sophia. She needs surgery. It's serious." Sophia was Megan's 6-year-old daughter. Sweet kid, big eyes, always shy around me, but polite. "What kind of surgery?" I asked, already grabbing my coat. "Her heart, a valve issue. Megan just found out. She's a wreck." I sat down. "Oh my God." "Her insurance won't cover all of it," he continued. "They need $120,000. She's trying to get a loan, but it's taking time, and they don't have time." There was a long pause. "I gave her the money," he said. I blinked. "What?" "I wired it this morning from our savings." All the air left my body. "That's all of our savings, Ethan." "I know, I didn't want to wait. I couldn't. If something happened to Sophia—" "Ethan, you didn't even talk to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was going to. I meant to. But Megan was crying, and she said they might lose her if they wait too long." I sat in silence. He continued, "She's your niece too, Salma." I closed my eyes. No, she wasn't. Not really. But I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded slowly. "We'll get through this." Because what else could I say? The next few days were a blur. Ethan was constantly on the phone, checking on Megan, asking about hospital forms, comforting her through tears. I stayed in the background. I cooked. I walked the dog. I answered emails I didn't remember sending. There were no updates on Sophia's condition. No texts, no photos, nothing on social media. I asked Ethan gently one night, "What hospital is she in?" He looked up from his phone. "I think it's St. Mary's." "You think?" "That's what Megan said." I nodded slowly. "And the doctor's name?" He hesitated. "I don't remember." That's when the pit formed in my stomach. Not panic, not fear, but the quiet ache of doubt. The next morning I called St. Mary's Hospital. I asked for the pediatric cardiac unit. Then I asked if there was a patient named Sophia Matthews scheduled for surgery that week. The woman on the other end paused. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "I can't find anyone by that name in our system." I tried not to panic. Maybe Megan used a different hospital. Maybe she gave a different name. But my gut, that deep, quiet voice that had always protected me, whispered something else. I waited until Ethan left for work. Then I drove across town to Megan's apartment. I told myself I was just going to check in, bring flowers, maybe a get-well card for Sophia. But when I knocked, Sophia answered the door, wearing pajamas, holding a juice box, and looking perfectly healthy. "Hi, Aunt Salma," she said with a big smile. I blinked. "Hey, sweetheart, is your mom home?" She nodded and ran inside. Megan appeared a moment later, looking slightly flustered. "Salma, what are you doing here?" I forced a smile. Just came to check on you guys. Ethan said Sophia had surgery? Megan's eyes darted behind me. She's recovering. She looks great, I said. Kids bounce back fast. There was silence. Then I said it. I called the hospital, Megan. Her face froze. I know there was no surgery, I continued. I know you lied. She took a deep breath. You have no idea what we're dealing with. I stepped forward. I know you took $120,000 from our joint savings, and I know you made Ethan feel like your daughter's life depended on it. Megan folded her arms. I had no choice, she said. You wouldn't have helped us otherwise. Helped you do what? What did you even use the money for? She looked away. It's complicated. No, I said, it's theft. She said nothing. I turned to leave, my hands shaking. I'm telling Ethan, I said. Megan's voice rose. If you do, you'll break his heart. I looked at her one last time. No, Megan, you already did. I drove home with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white, heart pounding. Every red light felt like a scream. Every second I sat in silence felt like betrayal. By the time I walked through the door, Ethan was in the kitchen reheating leftovers. He smiled when he saw me. Hey, babe, I thought you were meeting a client. I didn't answer right away. I dropped my purse, pulled out the printed statements, and laid them on the counter. He frowned. What's this? Proof, I said softly, that your sister lied. His smile faded. He picked up the papers, screenshots, call logs, the bank transfer, the hospital confirmation, everything. At first he just stared. Then slowly his face crumbled. No, he whispered. She wouldn't. She did, Ethan, I said, voice shaking. And I saw Sophia today. She's fine, running around in pajamas, sipping juice. He dropped the papers, then sat down and buried his face in his hands. I waited. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I feel sick. I know. He looked up. How could she do this? To me? To us? I don't know, I said, but you can't let it go. He shook his head. She's my sister. She's also a thief, I said, and she didn't act alone. He blinked. What? Do you really believe Megan came up with this on her own? You know who else had access to our banking information? His eyes widened. My mom. That single word hovered between us like smoke. We didn't talk to anyone for a week. Ethan stayed in the guest room. I worked late every night, buried myself in spreadsheets, client calls, anything to avoid thinking about what came next. But one morning, a knock came at the door. It was Daniel, Megan's husband. He looked nervous, tired, older somehow. Can we talk? He asked. I let him in. We sat at the dining table, the same one where Ethan had told me about Sophia's supposed surgery. I know what she did, Daniel said. I stared. You do? He nodded. I tried to stop her, told her it was wrong, but she was desperate. And Linda, she encouraged it. My throat tightened. Linda told her to do it? She framed it as survival, he said. Said Ethan owed the family, said it was just a loan, but Megan, she never planned to pay it back. I sat still, barely breathing. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. What's this? I asked. Audio recordings. Megan talking to Linda, planning the story. There's even one where Linda practices crying, so it sounds real on the phone. I blinked. You recorded them? He looked ashamed. I didn't trust them, and now I'm done. Why are you giving this to me? He sighed. Because you're the only one who hasn't lost your soul in this mess, and because I want out. That night I played the recordings for Ethan. At first he couldn't look at the screen. Then came the part where Linda said clear as day, just tell Ethan she's dying. He'll pay. He always does. And Ethan broke. I held him as he shook. Not with anger, but grief. 3 days later, we hosted Sunday dinner at our place, just like old times. Linda was the first to arrive. Megan came 20 minutes later, holding a pie like nothing had ever happened. They laughed, sat, complimented the wine. Then Ethan stood. I have something to say, he began, his voice calm. He pulled out the Bluetooth speaker, pressed play, and let the recording fill the room. Linda's voice, Megan's lies, the truth laid bare. When it ended, no one said a word. Megan's face was white. Linda's lips parted, but no sound came. Ethan looked straight at them. You used my love for you to steal from us, he said, and it's over. Linda stood. We're family. You don't turn on family. No, Ethan said. You did that. You just never expected to get caught. They left in silence. I closed the door, locked it, and exhaled. That night, Ethan and I sat on the couch. He looked at me, eyes raw. I let them manipulate me for years, he said. But you saved me. I smiled gently. No, you saved yourself. But I couldn't have done it without you. I leaned against him. And I wouldn't want to do life with anyone else. We sat in silence. No words, just healing. And the quiet promise of a new beginning. For the first time in years, our home felt still. Not silent in the awkward, heavy way, but calm. Like the tension had finally lifted, the storm had passed, and the air could be breathed in fully. Ethan was quieter those days, but different than before. He wasn't shrinking. He was processing, sitting with the truth, and I respected that. He began therapy, twice a week. At first, he called it just a check-in. But soon, he started sharing more. The sessions unearthed years of emotional blackmail, guilt-tripping, and the deep-rooted belief that his worth was tied to sacrifice, especially for his mother and sister. He told me, "I thought love meant giving, even when it cost you everything." I told him, "Real love doesn't ask you to bleed to prove you care." We were learning each other again, as two people who had both been lied to, used, and hurt, but who chose healing. One evening, Ethan brought out an old box from our closet. Inside were letters, childhood photos, and cards from Linda and Megan over the years. Some were sweet. Most were manipulative if you looked close enough. Messages like, "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. You're the only one we can count on. Don't tell Salma, it'll just stress her out." He lit a fire in the backyard pit and burned them one by one. Not out of spite, but as closure. That same week, we changed our phone numbers, closed the joint account, moved the rest of our savings to a new bank. We built boundaries like a fence around a garden, not to shut people out, but to keep ourselves protected. And then one day out of nowhere, we got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Megan's rounded print. "Dear Ethan and Salma, I messed up. I know that now. I wish I could take it back. But if you never want to speak to me again, I understand. Just please tell Sophia one day that her mom wasn't always like this. I'm sorry. Megan." Ethan read it, folded it gently, and placed it in the drawer by our bed. He didn't cry. He just said, "Let's never forget what it cost to finally be free." Months passed. Our life was simpler, cleaner, lighter. We took a road trip to Oregon, visited coastal towns we'd never heard of. We hiked in silence and danced to old love songs in our Airbnb kitchen. Ethan smiled more. I laughed more. And one night, while watching the stars in silence, he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I turned to him. "You gave me every reason to stay," I said, "even when everything else was breaking." He kissed my hand. "You brought me back." Later that year, we started something new, a small nonprofit offering emergency financial planning workshops to people who had been manipulated or financially abused by family members. It wasn't flashy, but it was powerful. Each person who walked into our little meeting room had a story. Some were daughters who supported toxic parents. Others were sons who had been guilt-tripped into draining their savings. Some were spouses, like me, who watched their families get torn apart by lies. We listened. We shared. We created plans. We helped them take back their power. And every time someone stood up and said, "I finally said no," we clapped, because we knew exactly how hard that sentence was to speak. It wasn't just a class. It was a revolution. A quiet, necessary one. And every session reminded us we weren't alone. Some scars you keep. Not because you want to relive the pain, but because they remind you how far you've come. That's what the whole experience became for me, a scar I didn't hide, but one I refused to scratch open again. Ethan and I didn't speak to Linda or Megan for the next 2 years. There were a few attempts from Linda. Birthday texts, a forwarded article she thought Ethan might like, once even a voicemail saying she was sick and didn't know how much time she had. But there were no real apologies, only emotional bait. We didn't bite. We had learned that manipulation wrapped in sweetness was still poison. Sophia, on the other hand, started writing letters to Ethan. They were innocent at first. Drawings of her school, stories about her pet rabbit, questions like, "Do you still like chocolate chip pancakes?" Ethan cried the first time he read one. We decided to write back. Short, warm responses. No guilt, no talk of Megan, just connection, child to uncle. Over time, it became a thread, not a bridge to the past, but maybe a path to a better future for her. Then one summer, Daniel called. It had been over 2 years since we last saw him. He asked to meet at a small cafe. Ethan and I sat across from him, unsure what to expect. Daniel looked different, lighter, like someone who had finally come out of a long tunnel. "I'm divorcing Megan," he said, stirring his coffee. "She hasn't changed, but I have." He told us Megan had continued her patterns. Lies, financial recklessness, twisting stories to serve herself. "But Sophia," he said, "Sophia deserves better." He asked if we'd be willing to stay in her life more directly, not to replace her mother, but to be a steady, safe presence. We didn't hesitate. And from then on, Sophia came to visit us twice a month. She loved our dog Jasper. She loved helping me cook. She loved building forts with Ethan out of couch cushions. And most of all, she loved planting things. Her favorite was marigolds. They look like little suns, she'd say. One evening, after Sophia had gone home, I stood in our garden, hands in the soil, the way I had years ago when I was still uncertain, still trying to believe in good things. Ethan came out and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "Do you ever think," he said softly, "that maybe the worst things that happened to us helped grow the best things?" I smiled. "I think pain clears space for truth," I said, like pruning a dying branch. He kissed my temple, and in that moment I knew this was it. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of one we chose. Today, I keep a framed quote on my desk at the nonprofit. It reads, "You are not cruel for protecting your peace. You are not wrong for saying no. You are not selfish for choosing your own healing." We teach that every week to our students. We write it into our welcome packets. We whisper it to the person sitting in the back of the room afraid to speak. And most of all, I remind myself of it every time I doubt. Every time I remember the girl I used to be. Quiet, polite, endlessly giving, endlessly forgiving. That girl is gone. In her place stands someone stronger. Not harder, not colder. Just rooted. And from those roots, a new life has grown. One that no one can lie their way into. One that no one can steal. One that belongs completely, fully, unapologetically to me.